Hello, this is Brett Knowles from PM2 Consulting. This is a quick walkthrough on the UGI FP&A conversation or presentation we'll be having in a few weeks' time. The idea here is I'd like to outline how the conversation is going to flow, obviously in less detail than we'll use on the day, to get your feedback on the content and the flow. We're going to be covering off three major things during the session. One is characterizing the common FP&A challenges that UGI and many other power-related utilities are encountering. We're going to talk about 5 quick wins which we have helped other clients achieve remarkably better planning performance in fairly short effort. And then finally, talking about the potential long-term solutions. So let's start off with the common FP&A challenges. So this Acme Power is the combination of 3 other clients that we've worked with that on average had about $1.7 billion in capital investments, about $400 million in annual maintenance investments, about a 8 to 10% shareholder return, a base of about $18 billion of base rate, about 60,000 miles worth of pipe, and about 4 million customers. So these are organizations that are of a similar size and a similar market to UGI. And what did they encounter? Well, their planning process sounds a bit like yours. They started off with some longer-term strategic plans, let's say looking out 5 years. And from that, they developed their financial plans, budgets, and forecast framework, big picture criteria. And then they handed those off to each of the product groups, regions, and departments. So the strategy plan is handed off to the financial planning people. They add their bit, and then each area takes a look at that and provides their response back. So a similar process to what we learned from our UGI interviews. For these organizations, on average, this planned cycle, this up and down cycle, occurs 6 times before sign-off. In other words, there's this ongoing iteration that goes back and forth. The total time for those 6 cycles, from the time the strategy plan is handed off to the time of sign-off, is on average 16 weeks. The UGI average appears to be 16. We did an assessment and learned that about 30% of senior leadership's time is consumed on this activity. And that results in about 25 man-years consumed per $1 billion of revenue. Or another way to look at it is on a cost base of about $1 million of cost to plan for about $1 billion of revenue. On average, they had 9 different systems that we were bringing together. They had fairly low quality of data. Managers did not follow the planning rules. So as guidelines were passed down, departments, individual managers would either not listen to the new plans and do it the old way, or do it some third way that was neither the original way or the revised way. And this resulted in a bunch of things, including a very high turnover of FP&A staff. And then finally, what we discovered is in 100% of the cases, the derived plans were actually obsolete even before the planning year began. So, we'll have a conversation about the similarities and differences with UGI, and then move on to talking about the 5 quick wins. The idea here these are 5 quick wins that these companies have used to achieve benefits. And they're quick wins. We can do them all within a couple of weeks. And the quick wins are this. 1, they move towards creating linked, integrated, and shared spreadsheets. 2, they simplified the planning model itself. 3, they eliminated the back and forth cycles from top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom. They focused more on what strategically matters, and they move towards monitoring and reacting faster. So before we step into these, let's take a look at some of the benefits they achieved. Through these 5 quick wins, they were able to drop the cost to produce a plan by about 30%. They're able to create plans that had about 60% less technical and mathematical errors in them. They're able to use about 30% less staff to create the plan, and they were able to increase the speed of producing the plan by about 25%. So let's step through these. First, creating shared spreadsheets. The concept here is pretty straightforward. It's that Acme lived in the same spreadsheet hell that we all live into. Characteristics like version control. They would come up with new versions that would not necessarily be shared, or if they're shared, not necessarily used. And it was really impossible to figure out what version people were working on as they submitted their department or regional plans. Secondly, broken telephone. The numbers seem to degrade from one spreadsheet to the next. In fact, they did some analysis and determined that there's about a 10% degradation with every spreadsheet that you used. So for example, if the spreadsheet was iterated 10 times, you virtually had a 0% accuracy rate by the time you're done. Unknown data source. Because people were dumping numbers into Excel, we didn't know where that root number actually came from, and therefore we lost all audit control, and management therefore quickly lost confidence in the numbers. We found that people would play around with formulas, and even if we protected the pages, hid them or super hid them, somehow or the other people were still getting in there and changing those computations. We found that there's a loss of dimensionality. So for example, we'd ask for data by region, but it would come back by rep. Or we needed it by product, but it was coming back by product SKU, for example. And so as we tried to convert those back, we found that we lost all sorts of fidelity. And lastly, unresponsive. It took so long to get a new planning process or changes rolled out that we just gave up. How did they solve it? Well, if you remember this back and forth problem that we had, what they began doing is linking the spreadsheets. So for example, the strategic and financial plans became a set of spreadsheets that were linked to other spreadsheets. So these spreadsheets had links so that if I changed something in the strategy or plan, it would automatically change in the subsidiary ones. Then the subsidiary ones would begin to create around these departments and products. So we'd set one for pipe size, we'd set another template for regulated industries, and so forth. And the idea would be, through this hub and spoke model, if anything changed in any one of these nodes, it would be reflected in all the other nodes because the appropriate files were linked. Examples would be as simple as if I was keeping additional information on a business unit, as soon as I changed that in the source file, all the linked files would reflect that same change. And of course, a small step forward from that is to maintain that on the cloud. So one of our clients used SharePoint, another one used Google Documents, a third used OneDrive. Regardless, what it meant is now the spreadsheets were linked together. So effectively, so was everyone in the business. So as one person changed their plan, it would automatically be seen by all the other people. As we changed one standard, it would ripple through all the other spreadsheets. And so we eliminated those issues of version control and so forth. How complicated was it? Well, not that bad. We allocated 2 weeks and got a bunch of planning and spreadsheet Jedi Knights in a room, and they just had a hackathon. They had a bunch of fun. They did it in a nice warm location, put everyone to it, and it was amazing what they were able to get done. By week 3, they did a WebEx launch. So spreadsheets were distributed, and everyone attended a 2-hour WebEx session, followed up by a 1-hour Q&A 2 days later. And we found that by week 4, we're operational with that new model. So the total cost was low, the elapsed time was low. Now what we'll do is poll the audience. Based on this, who here thinks we should try doing that in their business unit? And what we're trying to do is get a read for these quick wins about whether they make sense at UGI. So the second activity we took on was simplifying the planning model itself. So the underlying concept is this, that many planning processes are broken in that we have this overall strategic intent, that top level strategy, mission, vision, values. And we translate that immediately into tactical actions and resourcing through these plans. And the problem is we're missing this middle part where we translate strategic intent into strategic direction before we do the planning. I'll explain what that looks like. We should be able to list your strategic objectives down the left and how important they are, their weighting. And for each of your core processes, score that for strategy points, which are earned based on the accomplishment of those activities. And so, obviously, the more strategy points, the more important the process is. In fact, we color these black, dark gray, and light gray based on that strategic importance and that process's impact. So if we begin including this strategic importance into the planning equation, what ends up happening is we might have a strategic objective like we want to get revenue from new products. And we might consider that revenue is going to come from the small pipe, large pipe lines, and regulated electricity. And so that component of the plan is going to earn so many dollars and so many strategy points. We might have another strategy like revenue from existing products. They're going to come from other products and give us a different amount of strategy points and dollars. And so as we take a look at those strategic objectives, we can plot them to show the relative importance of each of those planning elements. In fact, we can take a look at that and begin to analyze the strategic impact by driver and the overall driver impact. And then as we identify those core drivers, we can be more assured that they are giving us both the dollar and strategic planning footprint that we need. To look at this in a more academic way, the ACME project was called Simply Does It. And the idea is if they take a look at the number of drivers, as we just saw, there's a almost non-linear exponential increase in error rate, failures, as we have too many drivers. In other words, the more drivers you have, the more errors you will have. We also took a look at the marginal utility of each next driver. So what ended up happening is after we got to sort of the sweet spot of drivers, at a certain point, each additional driver actually made the model worse. And the reason for that is we began getting conflicts between these new drivers and the existing ones. So we determined that there's a sweet spot. In the case of ACME, it was about 18 drivers. So we're going to focus on those 18 drivers and ignore the rest. And we estimated with those 18 drivers, it would give us about a 70% accuracy rate in the resulting model. So the fewer drivers, the better. Now, it proved to be the case. So if we take a look at one of the products, to begin with, on their global plan, they had a total of almost 18,000 drivers. And through this strategic evaluation, we got them down to 27. Now, remember, our target was 18, so we didn't do as well as we wanted to. And then we decided to measure the success of this plan based on 3 criteria. One is the planning accuracy, so the Simply Does It versus the original model. The actual prediction, so of course with the benefit of hindsight, let's see what the plan said and what actually happened. And then thirdly, agility. How fast could we react to changes, to variances in the outside environment or inside? And what we discovered is with these 27 drivers, we actually got a 82% success rate first pass. In other words, with those 27 drivers, when we modeled the business, we hit 82% of what we had before but of course at a fraction of the effort. It wasn't that hard to do it. It took 1 week to sort out last year's plan. It took us a couple of weeks to do the strategic driver model testing. And by week 4, we were operational. So again, show of hands, who's interested in taking this step? The next quick win was about eliminating the back and forth cycles. Remember, from corporate down and back up again. Now that process seems daunting, but it's pretty straightforward. Think of booking a suite of hotel conference rooms, and on day 1, the executive team, the senior team, developed their strategy map. What are their core objectives and their weightings for this year? On day 2, that team broke into each of their own operating units, whether it was a regional operating unit, a product operating unit, or a functional operating unit, and they developed their cascaded strategy map. And then we regrouped later in the afternoon to check for alignment across the strategy maps and contribution to the corporate map. Day 2 was a sign-off at that level. Day 3, we did that ontology. We took the strategic objectives, core processes, scored them to determine where our key drivers were. And that's where we reduced the number of drivers. Day 4, we built the simple rough cut plan. And then day 5, we aligned those plans across the business units to make sure they were consistent and had a sign off on the top level plan. So again, it seems daunting, but in fact, because we're all working together and we have these quick cross checks, it actually took a huge amount out of the planning process, almost 10 weeks on the first pass. This is effectively the techniques that we now know of in the software world is agile. Now, the effort to do this wasn't that great. It took us about 3 days to get the planning level strategy maps rough cut in advance. We used the 27 Simply Does It drivers from Quick Win number 2. We used the spreadsheets that we had built in Quick Win number 1. And within 7 days, we had the first rough cut plan created. Again, show of hands for interest. Quick Win number 4, reducing the number of people in the planning process. So this is what Acme called the less is more project. So they did 3 experiments across 3 equivalent business units. One team cut their plan with only the executive team. The second team did it as they currently do with the executive team and the leadership team. And the third team brought in some extra experts, the process experts that understood and worked in the processes day to day. And we measured them against 4 criteria. How many FTEs were required, the accuracy of the plans that came out, the error rates that occurred within the planning process, and the elapsed time. So, for the executive team that we're charting in green, it took about 5 FTEs to cut their plan. For the executive and leadership team, same as last year, blue took 15 weeks. Remember, we'd calculated the average was 16, so they did a bit better, or rather their average was 18. And then the broader team actually took more time. Obviously, more time, more teams, more debate. So in this case, of course, low values are better. The accuracy rate, in this case, high values are better. We had about an 80% with the executive team only, about an 85% with the executive and leadership teams, and about an 82% accuracy with the executive leadership and process experts. So the executive and leadership teams were marginally better, but statistically not that significant, and especially since we took away all agility. Error rates, now in this case low values are better. We had about a 10% error rate with the executive team only, double that at 20% with the executive and leadership teams, and almost triple that when we had the broader team. Obviously, more teams, more complexity, higher error rates. And in terms of elapsed time, it took about 4 weeks for the executive team only, compared to the 15 weeks for the executive and leadership team and 15 weeks for the executive leadership and process experts. So all indicators showed that having less people involved in the planning process gave us a much better answer at a lower cost. And it was easy, because all we're doing is telling people that they don't need to get involved in the planning process, which of course is met with wild enthusiasm. Week 1, we trained the executive team. Week 2, we launched it. Again, is this something that we can do here at UGI? Finally, how we monitor and react. Now, that's pretty straightforward. They use tools like Click and Tableau to grab these market plans and make them available to everyone. And very quickly, people learned how to use those tools to pivot tables and portray the data the way they wanted to. So we talked on our agenda about wanting to describe 5 quick wins, and we've done so. Now, let's talk about that longer-term solution. How do we make this something that all the organization can do and do it without the vulnerability of spreadsheets? And the bottom line is there's quite a few agile planning software tools which are emerging. They're cloud-based, so they're not that expensive. The interesting thing is they do all the things that we've just described, but without the spreadsheet, and you can actually implement them as easily as you can implement a spreadsheet. In other words, and I'm not going to advocate any tool in particular, but something like Anaplan is literally taking your existing spreadsheets, putting them in the tool, and you're done. And there's a bunch of benefits in how it works, but the net is we get that whole cloud-based integrated platform and all the version control issues and so forth taken care of at once. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. The issue is there's a bunch of off-the-shelf solutions. But when you move to that broader solution than just cobbling it together with linked spreadsheets, we get a bunch of benefits. And those benefits fit into 6 broad categories. First, if we take a look at our ability to change the plan, the problem is with the traditional planning process, once we launch it and we begin those 6 iterations back and forth, it's tough as heck to change the plan. Whereas in this agile world, because we keep doing a check back, so think of that 5-day plan, we do an activity, we check back. We do an activity, we check back on day 2. We do an activity, check back on day 3. And if we ever have a seismic event during the planning process, we just go back and redo that day. So we never lose the capability of changing the plan. So a very high ability to change. If we take a look at the visibility of the plan, in the traditional way, we launch the planning process and it kind of submarines. We don't see it until the 4th or 5th iteration when the image begins to emerge. Again, because we're doing this quick step check, we have ongoing visibility to the plan throughout the process. And this gives the board and leadership great control over reacting to real-time events during the planning cycle. If we take a look at the business value determined, there's really no business value in the traditional model until the plan comes out the other end. Whereas in the agile process, as we take each step and learn a bit more about our business unit and the plan and the integration, we keep on adding value. And certainly a lot is added during that first 5 days. So the idea is we get way better value over time. If you take a look at risk, traditionally, of course, there's a whole bunch of risk at the beginning, and it doesn't go away until we finish the plan. Whereas in the agile way, risk gets reduced very quickly because we address those big issues and solve them, address the next biggest risk issue and solve it, and so forth. So we manage to manage the risk quite quickly. And so it's interesting, if we combine these 2 bottom ones and take a look at business value and risk, those 2 curves move in the right direction. The people at Acme call this the fish curve. They recognize that they are driving increased value and reduced risk at the same time. Their net benefits, 61% lower cost to plan, 93% less errors in the plan, 39% less staff to plan in total, and a 24% increase in the speed of developing a plan. If I look at broader research, these are the sorts of numbers that we get out. Things like a much higher likelihood of having accuracy within the initial 5%. A 62% more likely to develop a complete budget with fewer iterations. More likely to be taking into account real-time data. A significant reduction in the cycle times. A significant increase in the amount of time that you, the financial analyst, can now spend on really value-added activities. And a much better level of forecast reliability. So that's the brief concept overview we'd go through and then move on to the workshop element.